It was a clear and clean Monday morning when Chuck walked into the kitchen of the ranch-style country home he and his wife owned. He had already showered and dressed, so a quick breakfast was all he needed to get out the door and get to work. The day promised to be beautiful and warm. However, he was surprised to find his wife Pamela, known to everyone as Pam, already cooking scrambled eggs and bacon in the kitchen. "Wow, honey, what's the special occasion?" While cooked breakfasts were the norm for Chuck and Pam on the weekends, it was a real rarity for her to cook them during the work week. His wife, slightly surprised at his sudden appearance, looked up at him with an expression he could have sworn was something between guilt and fear. A strained mask appeared on her face for only a second before Pam's face returned to its usual cheerful, smiling look. "Oh, honey, I was up this morning, so while you were getting ready, I decided to make us breakfast. Would you like a cup of coffee?" "Please," he replied before sitting down at the kitchen table. He set his iPad on the stand, logged in, and began his usual morning routine of checking the news. She, silently, handed him a black cup with 2 lumps of sugar, just the way he liked it. After a couple minutes, Chuck noticed Pam casting quick glances at him every 20 seconds or so before returning to her cooking. He wondered if this was some recent nervous habit of hers that had previously escaped his attention. Finally, it felt like Pam was hovering, Pam finally stuck a spatula under the scrambled eggs and transferred them to the plates, where she added a couple slices of bacon, a couple sausages, and a slice of toasted bread, whole wheat for health. Pam's version of a grand slam breakfast. Chuck appreciated her effort, however unusual it seemed for a weekday morning. They began, eating together, Chuck continuing to study his iPad while Pam sipped her coffee. She wasn't really eating, just smearing food on her plate as she continued to furtively glance at her husband. She couldn't seem to get comfortable in the chair. She kept fidgeting around as if she couldn't find the right spot. Finally, Chuck couldn't take it anymore and said, "Okay, Pam, what's going on? You're squirming in your chair like a 3-year-old and you seem very nervous about something. What's going on? Is there something you want to tell me? You've been crumpling the car more, haven't you?" No, honey, nothing like that." "Well, then, what is it?" Pam paused, gathering her thoughts, then sighed and spoke. "Honey, you know I sometimes read short stories on the internet, right?" Chuck nodded his head affirmatively. Sometimes they even talked about the stories if they had a plot or other elements that Pam found interesting. "Well, on my favorite website where I go for my stories," she paused and lowered her eyes to the table, "there are a lot of erotic stories. You know I've told you about them before. There are stories about lesbians and group sex or people doing things for the first time." Chuck smiled and nodded again. They had benefited from her reading some of those stories, and they both enjoyed it so much that it was now a regular, enjoyable addition to their sex games. They were pleasantly surprised at how eagerly they both talked about some of the erotic stories, although they agreed that many fantasies, as intriguing as they were actually quite risky. So they stuck to what they could do on their own in their bedroom. I don't know if I've ever told you, but there's a section of stories called Loving Wives. The stories in that section aren't always really sexy, and they can vary a lot. Some of them are about cuckolds. You know, men who are weak or who enjoy watching their wives have sex with other men. For example, there's one author, Matt Moreau, who... Okay, never mind, it doesn't matter now. Chuck frowned as he heard her describe that genre of short stories. He muttered something under his breath that Pam didn't understand, but thought it was something like, "It used to be cold in hell." There are also stories called Burn the Bitch, where a man discovers his wife is cheating on him and devises ways to get back at her and her lover. That thought seemed to cheer Chuck up a bit. "I bet I'd like them," Chuck put in with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Anyway," Pam continued, "late last night, before I went to bed, I was reading the short story, The Loving Wife." She looked again at Chuck, who raised his eyebrows and spread his hands in one of those, "okay, go ahead" gestures. "That scared me. It really scared me." "How could that damn story scare you so much?" He demanded an answer. "I just thought the story was written about us," Pam replied in almost a whisper. "What do you mean by that?" "First of all, The characters. Their names were Charles and Pamela. Chuck laughed out loud. Do you have any idea how many couples named Charles and Pamela there probably are in the United States? I mean, in my mind, there's probably something like 60 million married couples. And out of that 60 million, there are probably literally hundreds of thousands of couples who have our names. There's nothing to be afraid of. Yeah, but Pam objected. In this story, they have the same age as us. He was 31, and she was 29. And even more than that, he worked in corporate finance at Fortune 1000, like you, and his wife was a real estate agent, like me, and supposedly they'd been married for 7 years, just like us. Okay, Chuck agreed with a smile. Now we have maybe a few thousand couples left. In this story, he's 5'10" inches and weighs 170 pounds, just like you, and she's 5'5" inches and weighs 125 pounds, just like me, she added triumphantly, as if that proved her right. Although the author of this story never said anything like, his wife was a walking wet dream. Pam thought it mattered because Chuck often told her how hot she was, so the story wasn't copied from their real life. Honey, you should have studied statistics in college. The author made her characters regular average people. So what? We're pretty much the same as those fictional characters. We're both pretty average height and weight. Chuck thought for a second. Too bad I'm not over 6 feet tall. I swear taller guys get promoted faster than I do. That's not all. Pam hesitated, about to speak again, but Chuck had already risen from the table. He grabbed his briefcase, folded up his iPad, and took it with him as he stood up. Walking past her, he kissed the top of her head. Don't let some stupid coincidence in a fantasy novel scare you. Walking out the front door, since for some reason he'd left his car in the driveway instead of in the garage last night, he continued talking to her. I gotta go. I'm already running late. Hopefully there won't be much traffic. Bye, was the last thing he said as he closed the door behind him. Pam rushed to the door and swung it open. Chuck, she shouted after him. You didn't even kiss me properly. Chuck, I love you, Chuck. Pam, now almost panicked, looked after him, then up and down the street. Here. There were no strange cars, and no one she didn't know, no people waiting to suddenly serve her. She collapsed into a chair in the hallway, breathing a sigh of relief. Oh my God, Chuck, she said, turning to the empty room. This woman had a lover named Doug who worked in her office, just like me. And they had an affair for 3 months, just like mine. She burst into tears and then sobbed. At least she hadn't been served with divorce papers right after her husband left for work, as had happened in that story. Chuck, I love you so much, she said aloud, and my affair is over, finished. And I'm going to rededicate myself to you and our marriage. I'm going to make you the happiest, most contented man anyone has ever known. With those words, feeling as if she had escaped the axe in her marriage, Pam rose from her chair and went back into the bedroom to get ready for work. She even hummed to herself as she thought about the dinner of Chuck's favorite dishes she was going to make, as well as how reconciling with Chuck after there would be sex. Even if he didn't know it was a mask, and just thinking about it made her become wound up. Pam had always been the consummate professional. She sat at her desk, as she should, dressed professionally and modestly, yet feminine and attractive. She was always a pleasant person and was very popular in her office. That Monday morning, she was looking at the many listing service flyers, actually computer screens these days, to see what new listings had been added and what homes had sold over the weekend. She scrutinized listings and sale prices in several neighborhoods where she knew people who were thinking of putting their properties up for sale. Later in the afternoon, she could pay them a visit and check out a few of the new listings herself. In fact, she was so absorbed in planning an efficient use of her day that she didn't even notice the young woman who entered the office, stopped, and spoke to the receptionist at the front desk before returning to Pam's desk. Excuse me, the young woman with long blonde hair asked, chewing like a cow chewing gum. Are you Mrs. Pamela Anderson? Her automatic smile appeared as she gave her standard answer. Yes, but not that Pamela Anderson. She expected the usual smile and chuckle, But instead the young woman simply flicked the gum in her mouth and handed her a manila-colored envelope. "Mrs. Anderson, you have been served," she said rather loudly, as if to get the attention of all the people working in the office, and then, without wasting any time, turned and walked out of the office. The young woman had only one stack of papers to hand in that day, a certain Pauline French. She hoped to catch her in the office as well. Pam stared at the envelope for several minutes before she could bring herself to open it. She was embarrassed, frustrated, and hurt. Divorce forms spilled out of the envelope onto her desk. She looked around, and she thought everyone in the office was looking at her as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her hands fumbled around her desk looking for her cell phone, which she couldn't immediately find through her tears. When she found it, she found her favorite in her contact list and called her husband at work. Pam and Chuck rarely called each other during work hours. They considered it undignified and a display of unprofessionalism. But given the circumstances, those restrictions went out the window. At this point, Pam wanted more than anything for Chuck to take her call and give her a chance to explain herself and plead with him. "Finance Department, Chuck Anderson speaking," came her husband's voice. "Oh, Chuck!" Pam blurted out, half in awe, half in gratitude that he had actually answered the phone. "I just got served with divorce papers here at work. Oh my God, Chuck, I don't want you to divorce me." She sobbed incoherently for half a minute while Chuck waited patiently for her to come to her senses. "This morning, when I didn't get served at home after you left for work, I thought the story was just as you said, just a silly fabrication, but—" "Wait a minute," Chuck finally spoke up. "Are you saying that in the story you read online, the female character was served divorce papers in the morning at home, not at work?" "Yes, Chuck. That's why I thought I was safe." "Man, oh man, this is a big mistake. This shouldn't have happened." "Thank God, Chuck. I knew this was some kind of mistake. I love you so much. I just knew you wouldn't divorce me over some stupid sex." Chuck mumbled something to himself. "Damn, I must have downloaded the wrong version of the story. I know it's being serviced at work in the final edit. Maximum embarrassment and all that." "Pam," he ordered, "do you have an open story to check this out?" "What? Well, sure. Let's have a look. Yes. A gum-chewing young blonde with long hair shows up at the door just after Chuck leaves for work and serves Pam while she's still in her nightgown and robe. Fuck. I'm going to have to take that version down and replace it with the correct final version. How can I be so stupid? I mean, just think of all the people who have already read and commented on the original publication. All of that would be lost. Oh, by the way, Pam, after I found out about your affair, I really had no choice. The divorce is still going on." The phone suddenly disconnected. Pam looked at the screen again. Rereading the text on the screen, she realized that by now, her credit cards with her husband had probably been canceled, and half of the money in their joint savings and checking accounts had probably been moved. She was almost certain that when she returned home, she would find Chuck's clothes and personal belongings missing. Thank goodness he wasn't trying to get a restraining order or anything like that in this story. She figured her keys would unlock the house anyway. At that moment, Pam's attention was caught by some movement at the front of the office. It was her lover, or ex-lover, or whatever he was, Doug, coming back down the aisle. "Doug? What happened to you?" Pam heard the receptionist ask. "Wow, big guy. You look like someone worked you over, but good," joked one of the agents, and there was no surprise or regret in his voice. Doug looked around and decided he might as well get rid of his explanation. "Last night after I finished bowling with a couple buddies, I was attacked as I was walking back to my car. I didn't see anyone because it was dark, and I think someone hit me with a baseball bat right at the start. So I was semi-conscious. They grabbed my coat, my wallet, and a brand new, only used bowling ball once. How low can you go? That's all I can tell you because that's all I remember." He continued walking to his desk across the aisle from Pam's desk. While Doug was describing their meeting yesterday, Pam was rereading the last part of the story on the computer. Her eyes suddenly went wide, and there was a look of horror on her face as everything became clear. Walking by, Doug looked at Pam. "Hey, honey, let me tell you that my day didn't go very well." Doug sat down at his desk, and almost immediately the receptionist called out to him. "Doug, your wife is online too?" Pam looked at her former lover, shaking her head with an expression on her face that was something between a smirk and a grimace as Doug picked up the phone. She had already reread the end of the story. "And believe me, Doug, in 30 seconds it's only going to get worse.